All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your night for joining us tonight for the webinar on the application information session for the San Francisco Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative. My name is Sarah Schwid. I'm the Training and Real Estate Associate in the Consulting Department at Community Vision, and I'll just be doing a brief introduction and supporting today's webinar behind the scenes. Our presenters today are from Community Vision. They are Camila Andrea Mena, who's the Grants and Program Associate at Community Vision. I already said that. And Risa Boomline-Keeper, Managing Consultant for Grant Making and Financial Management. We're also joined by Lex Leifheit, who's the Senior Business Development Manager at the San Francisco Office of Economic and Workforce Development, and she's going to give a brief introduction of OEWD. And as we begin our presentation, I'd like to start off by acknowledging the original stewards of the land that we live and work on. I'm broadcasting from Muchin, which is the traditional, ancestral, occupied, and unceded territory of the Lishan Ohlone people. We recognize that as we work towards racial and economic justice, we simultaneously benefit from the use and occupation of their land. We also recognize the work that Indigenous communities are doing today to reclaim, rematriate, and preserve their land and culture. Just a few housekeeping items. We are recording this session and it will be available on our website afterwards. Also, we have the recording from the last information session that we did as well. That'll be up. And we're going to send out the presentation via email to everybody who registered. We welcome your questions, and you can feel free to drop them in the chat at any time. It would be great if you could remember to select the all panelists and attendees option in the drop-down menu so that everybody can see your question. And we'll do our best to answer them during the webinar, but if we miss them, we'll be sure to circle back at the end. We have some time for questions during that. So our agenda is going to start with a brief overview of Community Vision. Then we'll move into the overview of, well, first it'll be the OEWD overview and then the Community Vision overview. Then we'll talk about NSI a little bit more broadly, go into speaking about the acquisition grants, then lease stabilization grants, technical assistance, and then we'll have time for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and pass things to Lex.
Thanks, Sarah. Good evening, everyone. And thank you. I echo what Sarah said. Thank you for your commitment to your causes and to your organizations and your mission by taking the time to be here after what has probably for many of you been already been a long day. I see some familiar organizations introducing themselves in the chat: United in Love, RAMS, La Raza Community Resource Center, Eviction Defense Collaborative, St. James Infirmary. It's great to see familiar names and organizations that are having so much impact in San Francisco. Again, my name is Lex Leifheit, and I work for the San Francisco Office of Economic and Workforce Development. A little bit about us. We have, many different divisions, and we work to advance equitable and shared prosperity for all San Franciscans by growing sustainable jobs, supporting businesses and nonprofits of all sizes, creating great places to live and work, and helping everyone to achieve economic self-sufficiency. Very briefly, some background on this program. The Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative, which over the past 5 years has deployed various forms of financial assistance and professional services available to nonprofits who are working and deeply rooted in low-income communities, really started because of your advocacy and the advocacy of nonprofit leaders, particularly those in human services, arts, and culture, who were being priced out, who were, feeling extremely challenged and stretched thin to afford the high cost of real estate in San Francisco, and who knew that their communities really deserved high quality, permanent facilities and long-term facilities so that you could build trust in your communities and be a constant resource. And since we launched the first awards in partnership with Community Vision 5 years ago, we've just seen throughout this pandemic what an enormous impact you all have had. Looking at these photographs here as some examples, to provide a strong start to our youth through organizations like Mission Kids, who received an acquisition grant, to provide a resource hub for the immigrant and API communities on the west side of the city through organizations like CYC, who received a grant for permanent space for their resource hub in the Richmond district, and just so many others. Community Vision has been a really wonderful and trusted partner. And before I hand it off to Camila Mena and Risa Keeper to tell you more about this program in particular, I just wanted to let you know that before I jump off, I will be posting some additional OEWD resources and links in the chat. And if it turns out that this particular grant program that we support through Community Vision does not meet all of your needs, which are often great for many organizations, or if it's just not a right fit at this time, we absolutely want to hear from you. Your feedback is going to help us continue to work with Community Vision and shape this program, and even grow other resources that benefit you and help you advance your missions. With that, I will pass it on to the team at Community Vision.
Thanks so much, Lex. And I'm just going to give a brief overview of more about what we do at Community Vision for folks who might not be as familiar. And then we'll get started with the rest of our presentation. So we're an over 30-year-old community development financial institution, or CDFI, and we serve an area that spans nearly the northern 2/3 of California, which is from Bakersfield to the Oregon border. As a locally invested collaborative partner in social justice and financial equity, we provide nonprofits, businesses, and social enterprises with flexible financial products through our lending department, and guidance and technical assistance through our consulting department. And of course, through our grant making department, which has just been growing so much over the years, as Lex has said. And we also create opportunities to make socially responsible investments. Just a little bit more about our consulting department, in which we do real estate and financial management consulting. Enabling the preservation of valued community space is central to our work. Through financial management and real estate guidance and grant making in our consulting department, we successfully mitigate displacement and provide stability to those to strengthening and enhancing resources offered to communities on the margins of opportunity. And I'm going to go ahead and put our website into the chat, and we will provide other resources as we go along here too, that are on other components of our website. Okay, I believe, Risa, it is your turn. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Lex. And thanks to everyone for spending an evening here with us, talking about grant program guidelines after just echoing Lex, what must have been a very long day for you all. So we will try to get all of your questions answered. And of course, we're always available on email at grantmaking@communityvisionca.org. So the Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative, as Lex mentioned, has been in the works for several years. It's a partnership between OEWD, the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development, and SFAC, and Community Vision administers the grants and the technical assistance. And since 2017, we have supported the acquisition of over 175,000 square feet of new permanent nonprofit-owned space, and we've stabilized through leasing nearly 275,000 square feet of nonprofit-occupied space. And we're thrilled to be partnering with these different city agencies to administer this program. This partnership allows us to reach, as many nonprofits who are deeply rooted in low-income communities as we can through both our networks and our partners networks and our community nonprofit partners networks as well. Next slide. So this is just a bit of an overview about the program. There are 2 funding buckets available in addition to technical assistance, which we'll talk about later. The Lease stabilization grants are available for organizations who have leases of 3 years or longer. If you have a 3-year or a 4-year lease, you are eligible for up to $50,000. And if you have a 5 or more year lease, you're eligible for a grant of up to $75,000. On the acquisition side, we make grants up to $1 million or 25% of the purchase price, whichever is lower. So if your building costs $4 million or more, then you would be eligible for a grant of up to $1 million. If it's under $4 million, then we would use 25% purchase of the purchase price calculation. And on the acquisition grant side, the grants are used to support the acquisition of new nonprofit-owned space, which means that we're supporting more square footage being turned over into the hands of nonprofits. So if the seller is a nonprofit, then you would not be eligible for a grant under this program. And that does include churches. And in the current funding cycle, we have $2 million available for acquisition grants and $500,000 available for lease stabilization grants. The timeline has been extended. I hope you all got our many email and e-newsletter and social media blasts and posts and shares to learn that it has been extended to Friday, January 28th at 12 p.m. We're anticipating making award announcements in late March, the week of the 21st. And then the grant disbursement deadline is at the end of February in 2023. That means that the grant funds need to be requested, and it is on a reimbursement basis. They need to be requested with proof of payment, proof of receipts, and various other documentation that we'll review later. And we request the funds from the city, and then the city sends the funds through us and we send the funds to you. So there's a little bit of a turnaround time there, and all of the funds do need to be dispersed by the disbursement deadline. I will attempt to answer questions as we go, so please feel free to drop any questions you have in the Q&A. If you do put them in the chat, I apologize in advance if I miss them. Sometimes it's hard to track. But I see that someone has a question in the Q&A. So let's see, the dates for the notification and disbursement are mixed up. I'm not sure what you're seeing, Kathy, but we are anticipating announcing the awards. So you will learn whether you received an award or not the week of March 21st of this year. And then the disbursement deadline is the following year. Yeah, okay, good. All right, let's go to the next slide. So the eligibility requirements for the nonprofit organization that's applying are listed here. So the nonprofit must be located in San Francisco. It must be a tax-exempt nonprofit organization or fiscally sponsored by one. And the organization must have a track record of at least 2 years of providing services, direct or indirect, to members of low-income communities, historically underserved communities, and disinvested communities, and communities of color. And then we also ask that you not be in default on any other grants or loans from us or our partners. And this is a wonderful photo of a former or past grantee women's audio mission. They support young girls in learning all about recording, the recording industry and digital music, and give them pathways to become producers if that's something that they choose to do in the future. Next slide. So the program priorities are listed here. There are 5 key program priorities. After we screen for eligibility, for example, are you a tax-exempt 501c3 organization? Are you located in San Francisco? We move on to the priority screen, and these are the areas that are scored in the selection process. And the 5 areas are: 1, being deeply rooted in low-income communities; 2, facing significant financial constraints; 3, demonstrating support from multiple sectors; 4, clear plan for engaging beneficiaries; and 5, demonstrating evidence of planning to mitigate risk. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of these in just a few slides. Next slide. So for the first program priority area, deeply rooted, we define this as understanding the experiences and needs of the individuals and the communities being served, connecting with and commanding respect and trust from those communities, developing relevant partnerships over time, and having a governance structure that allows beneficiaries to hold power and influence decisions in the organization. So we want to know that the organization is deeply rooted through programs and services that are community driven, community defined, and community self-determined, and that there are opportunities for leadership from the beneficiaries themselves within the organization. So some examples of ways you might demonstrate this in the application are to describe your governance systems and how they include beneficiaries. Perhaps you have a community advisory committee, or you have a pathway into being on the board for beneficiaries who have received services from your organization in the past. Perhaps you hire from the community, and there are lots of other ways to show this as well. These are just some examples. Next slide. So the second priority area is financial constraints. So we're looking for organizations that face financial constraints in the nonprofit sector. And the way we define financial constraints are business models that are tight, that generate a limited amount of unrestricted revenue or the ability to set aside reserves. Perhaps you have a break-even budget or a budget that's generating just a small surplus. Maybe you have a lot of restricted revenue, so your revenue is high, but your expenses are high, and all of the revenue is allocated and spoken for, versus earned revenue, which allows you to set aside funds in a discretionary manner and use them just discretionarily. We look for organizations that have small budgets but are resourceful with the resources that they have. We look for budgets that are growing really slowly. Perhaps the revenue streams don't change, but the fixed expenses increase over time. Limited fundraising staff or the ability to generate new revenue opportunities. Or perhaps there's concentrated sources of revenue where your organization is really reliant on 1 or 2 funders. Next slide. The third program priority area we look at is support for multiple sectors. So we want to know more about your community partnerships. We want to know who you work with and who you've developed trust and collaborated on programs with over time. So for example, you could include public-private partnerships or firms or organizations that have volunteered with you. For example, perhaps you have pro bono legal support, or perhaps you did some renovations in your space and someone volunteered their time to give you free drawings. Or maybe you have a fundraising expert on your board who's volunteered some of their professional time to help you fundraise. That would be volunteerism and pro bono support. On the volunteerism side, perhaps you're able to recruit folks from the community to support you on volunteer days, to help you provide services, meet people where they're at, give you more hands on deck to be able to generate and produce more for San Francisco residents. That would be, evidence of support. We're looking for letters of support as well. So an MOU or a memorandum wouldn't suffice. We really want a formal letter. And this could also be like another organization that you collaborate with to provide co-programming, for example. And I've talked about some examples, but other ones are listed here. Perhaps you're planning to attract new champions to your organization. How are you going to do that? What relationships will you be drawing on? And how are those relationships deeply rooted in low-income communities? Next slide. So the fourth program priority area is having to do with beneficiaries. So we want to know where your beneficiaries are coming from, both primary and secondary clients. So the primary clients would receive direct services. Secondary clients would maybe benefit from the direct services that the primary clients receive. So for example, children who receive direct services would be primary clients and their families would be secondary clients. And we want to know, based on your real estate, need or your project, how are you planning to maintain the current clients or beneficiaries who you have and potentially attract new ones? So if you're moving, for example, let's say you're moving from one district to another within the city, what are you doing to plan for engaging in a new community where you'll be rooted in? How are you going to bring your current beneficiaries with you into the new space across town? Or if you're planning to stay in the space that you are currently in, how are you continuing to create, to be responsive and create opportunities for your beneficiaries to influence your organization? So designing those services and attracting new beneficiaries in your current community. And then again, I haven't spoken on all of the pictures here, but we have lots of pictures of our past grantees. This is the Gay Men's Chorus. They did receive a Lease Stabilization grant. This is at one of their practices. Next slide. And I do see a question. Is an MOU not acceptable as demonstration of partnership? No, we would need a formal letter of support. Okay, and then the fifth area, program priority area is risk mitigation. So we're looking at how your organization plans and plans for risk mitigation, plans to address upcoming budgetary issues, plan for changes, financial changes in the future, and what are the ways that you mitigate those risks at the senior leadership and board level over time. So for example, we look for multi-year budgets, strategic plans, other types of policies and procedures. Perhaps you have a succession plan that will mitigate the risk of financial changes during a CEO or leadership transition, and other governance policies that you use to ensure that amidst fluctuations, your organization will stay solid and on strong financial ground. Some of the other ways to demonstrate this could be how you're transparent within your leadership and management processes, how you budget and what types of budgets you use to project when you might be facing a deficit and get in front of that, figure out a way to financially support that in advance. And if you receive city funding, you can also submit your city monitoring reports as another way of showing how your policies and procedures are audited and approved by your program officers at the various city agencies. And here we see West Bay Filipino Multi-Service Center. They just recently received an acquisition grant for a new property in Soma. Next slide. So in addition to the 5 key program priority areas, we also evaluate, your application is evaluated on 3 additional criteria, the review criteria. So these ones are listed here: urgency, project readiness, and co-location. Urgency speaks to the extent to which the grant will address an urgent need and provide catalytic funding. And that means, we really want to see that this grant is going to catalyze your organization forward in the project. Perhaps it will leverage additional funding. Perhaps it will allow you to jumpstart the project in some way. And we also look at project readiness. This is a big one for the NSI program. We want to know that your team, your timeline, and your plans are viable and feasible and ultimately won't end up putting you in any sort of a position that could be financially risky. So we're looking at the technical capacity to plan and develop and operate the proposed project. And there are various attachments and documents on the application which help us to determine this. And then co-location is the last one. Co-location is incentivized in this program. We like to see organizations working together to leverage their resources and utilize space and maximum efficiency. So we look for 2 or more organizations stabilized at the same property with leases. And not just from a real estate perspective or programmatic perspective, but there are other ways that co-location can really help organizations, such as centralizing back office services and reducing costs for both organizations. And here's another acquisition grantee, San Francisco Conservation Corps. Next slide. So here we'll talk just a little bit more about the structure of the acquisition grants. As I mentioned before, we have up to $2 million available in this current funding cycle. And the grants go to organizations that are purchasing new nonprofit-owned space. So again, if the space that your organization is considering purchasing is currently owned by a nonprofit, including a church, you would not be eligible for this program. The maximum grant award is the lesser of $1 million or 25% of the purchase price. So for example, if your purchase price is $3 million, you would be eligible for a grant up to $750,000. And as I mentioned before, grant proceeds must be dispersed by February of 2023. And in the acquisition grant program, we typically disperse into escrow at the time of closing. So that means that your other financing, the other 75% that the grant would not fund, the other financing would need to be closed as well by this disbursement deadline. Consultation calls are required for the acquisition program. So if you are planning to apply for an acquisition grant, you need to schedule a consultation call today. Today is the last day to schedule them, and calls are available through the end of the week. If you do not see a time that is available that fits your schedule, please email us at grantmaking@communityvisionca.org. Next slide. Since the program is focused on nonprofit stabilization, we ensure that the property will be used for nonprofit use for a period of 30 years. So if you are receiving an acquisition grant, there is a 30-year compliance period of nonprofit use secured with a deed of trust and a use restriction recorded on the title of the property. And then annually, Community Vision works with our acquisition grantees to submit various documents, including evidence of insurance, certificate of no adverse change, and basic financial and impact information for the first 5 years. And then if you're planning to lease space, if you are planning to purchase a building and then lease space within the square footage that's funded by this program, the tenant must also be a nonprofit. And in the reporting piece, when we work with our acquisition grantees on an annual basis, we will ask about any tenancy happening in your building, and we can, discuss more about that through the process of the annual monitoring. I see some questions in the chat. Let's see. Hi, Krista. So I see your question. On the checklist of required information, it states the following. Can you please clarify what is required? MOUs or letters of support. Provide evidence of documentation of up to 3 community partnerships. Documentation can include service agreements, MOUs, or contracts. Letters of support are not considered documentation. Yes, you're right, Krista. Thank you for correcting me. So letters of support are not considered documentation. MOUs would be fine. So let me clarify that. A letter of support would be like asking a volunteer to write a letter for you saying, I'm a volunteer, this organization is great, you should really, make a grant to this organization, versus an MOU or a more formal collaboration agreement that says, you know, this organization X and organization Y work together for a period of 3 years to deliver X, Y, or Z program. Thank you for correcting me on that. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Let's see, our letters of support required for the proposal. This is an area where the applicants are scored. So there is a section for you to upload. It shouldn't be required in the application, but it will, of course, you know, strongly advance your application because you will be scored on your evidence of support from multiple sectors. If, for example, you didn't submit any and you didn't refer to this at all in the application, you would probably be scored at a 0 for that category. Okay, next slide. Gabriel, I see your question. How do we schedule a consultation call? Camila or Sarah can post the link in the chat. There are only a few time slots left. So if you don't find something that works for you, just let us know. I also just want to mention that the consultation calls are only for acquisition grant applicants. So if you're considering applying for the lease stabilization pool, please reach out to us by email or you know, ask by email to schedule a call. The consultation call list of available times on Calendly is really for those who are applying for acquisition grants only. So really only for those who are planning to purchase a building, and we try to reserve it for them just because it is required for them, whereas it's not required for lease stabilization applicants. Okay, so here are a couple of examples. In this example, an organization plans to acquire a building for $8 million. The property needs to be renovated and construction costs are estimated at $2 million. The total project budget is $10 million. How much is the organization eligible to apply for? And this is sort of a trick question. The answer is $1 million. That is the maximum amount eligible per grant in this program. And the acquisition cost is over $4 million, so they are eligible for the maximum amount. Next slide. An organization is in discussions to acquire a building. The owner is interested, but probably won't be able to finalize a letter of intent by, and this should say January 28th. Application due date. Is the organization eligible? And the answer is no. Site control is required for your application, and that is true for both the acquisition and the lease stabilization pools of funding. And site control could be met by having a fully executed letter of intent for a purchase or a lease, or a fully executed lease, or a fully executed purchase and sale agreement, or if you've previously purchased the building, you could submit your grant deed. And if you are submitting with a previously signed lease, the lease would need to be executed between October 1st of 2020 and the application deadline. We do have a look back period in this program, and that's included in our program guidelines. The look back period is October 1st of 2020 for the lease stabilization pool. And for the acquisitions, I believe it's May of 2021. Is that right, Camila?
That is correct.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So in this example, the organization purchased a building in June. It was financed through these various different forms. Is the organization eligible to apply? And in this case, they are within the look back period that goes to back to May 1st. So they are indeed eligible. If their purchase had closed in, let's say April, they would not be eligible to apply in this funding cycle. Okay, next slide. Now I will pass it over to Camila, who will share a little bit more about the lease stabilization grants, as well as the technical assistance part of the NSI program.
Good evening, everyone. I really just want to once again thank you for joining us at 6 p.m. So I will give an overview of the lease stabilization grants. There are $500,000 available to support organization with lease stabilization costs. So more specifically, organizations with a 3 to 4 year lease are eligible for a grant of up to $50,000, and organizations with a lease of 5 or more years are eligible for a grant of up to $75,000. In terms of the requirements, organizations that are applying for lease stabilization grants must have a lease or letter of intent executed on October 1st of 2020 or later. And so to be fully executed, the lease or letter of intent need to be fully signed by both the applicant and the landlord. It's also really key to note that if a letter of intent is submitted with your application, a fully executed lease will be required before the grants are released to you. And so additionally, the terms of the lease must be the same or more favorable to the organization than the terms that were submitted with the LOI in the application. So for instance, your application, your your lease can have a lower rent or the same rent costs as the letter of intent. It's also really, really important to keep in mind that if you decide to change your site after you have submitted your application and after the application deadline, your application will be withdrawn from the pool. So that's just really something that I recommend that you keep in mind as you go through the application process. In addition, at least a 3-year lease is required to be eligible for a grant. And the application, the organization that is applying must be at risk of displacement or facing barriers to growth. And I'll describe it a little bit more a few slides later. And lastly, as Risa mentioned earlier, the disbursement deadline for the grants is February 28th of 2023. I see a question. Can you talk a little bit about the rent per square footage? And if so, need to demonstrate what lease is higher. I'm definitely going to touch on that. So I'll make sure to note when I'm answering that question within the application, the presentation, Kathy. Thank you. Next slide, please. So now I'll go over the eligible fund uses. Organizations can use the grant to pay for the costs associated with a renewal of their lease. They can also use funds to pay for up to 6 months of the difference between their prior lease and their current lease. They can also use them to pay for movable furniture, fixtures, or other equipment. And these are things that have no permanent connection to the structure of the building. Within the space, this is available for organizations that are requesting a minimum of $10,000 in funding. And they must also be related to one-time moving costs. Other uses of funds include professional services. So you can use them to contract engineers, architects, attorneys. They can also cover staff time that is spent coordinating or implementing your project. So anytime that you use to, in the contracting process or meeting with your lawyers or your architects, for instance. They can also be used for moving expenses. So hiring a moving company to support you if that's what you're using the funds for. You can also, if you are submitting a lease that has over 5 years or in these terms, you are eligible for funding to cover tenant improvements, such as construction at the site. Next slide, please. So now I'll go over a few examples of projects and organizations within the program. So in this scenario, the organization has an old lease for a 1,000 square foot space that is leased at $2,000 per month. And so that is $2 per square foot per month. The new lease will have, is 2,000 square feet. It is leased at $4,500. So that is $2.25 per square foot per month. And so the question here is, what is the eligible rent stipend for this project? And so if anyone has a guess, I would super welcome you to enter in the chat if you would like to, but I'll give the answer as well. So this organization is only eligible to receive a rent stipend for the displaced square footage. So that would be 1,000 square feet. And this rent stipend is calculated by taking the difference in the monthly rent and the square footage and multiplying it by the displaced square feet. So specifically, the difference in monthly rent per square foot would be $2.25 minus the $2. So that makes 25 cents. Then the rent stipend per month is calculated by multiplying those 25 cents times the 1,000 square foot in difference. So that is $250. And then the total rent stipend for the 6 months is calculated by multiplying those $250 times the 6 months, which is equal to $1,500. Next slide. In this scenario, the organization is in discussions to acquire a new building. So the owner is interested in selling, but probably won't be, oh, sorry, I am in the wrong document on my end. In this scenario, the organization received a draft letter of intent from a building owner that includes the square footage, it includes the terms as well as the address. And the owner has signed the LOI. If the nonprofit signs, will this fully executed LOI meet the eligibility criteria for the program? And the answer in this case is no. In addition to the terms listed above, the LOI also needs to include the price per square foot. Next slide. And in this scenario, an organization is negotiating a 2-year lease with a 1-year option to extend. And so the question is, would this organization be eligible to apply for a grant from the Lease Stabilization program? And in this case, the answer is no. And that is because the minimum base term of the lease before the options needs to be 3 years. And so because they only have a 2-year lease with the 1-year option, they would not be eligible to apply for a grant from the Lease Stabilization program. Next slide. So now I will go into the application process. Applications must be submitted through the form of assembly application portal by Friday, January 28th at 12 p.m. Really key here to note that we cannot accept late submissions. So we recommend that you submit your application before the deadline if possible, so that we're able to support you if any technical issues arise or if you have any questions along the way. I will say here also a cool feature of the application portal is that you're able to save your progress. So you will have the option to go into the application, type in your answers, fill in required fields or upload documents and save it, and then return to it at a later time that works for you. I also really want to emphasize here that it's really important that you actually press the submit button at the end of the application. It happens very rarely, but we have seen some organizations that for one reason or another don't press the button. So that's just key to note that even though you could save the progress, the submit button is what actually submits your application. And lastly, to support you with the application process, there are checklists. Here we go. Thank you. Checklists of required information for both programs. You can find them on the program guidelines. So you can find what documents you will need to upload as well as a document that will link you to the questions that that are required or the ones that may be applicable for your project. Next slide, please. The Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative also offers technical assistance to organizations. These organizations are facing, permanent displacement or barrier to growth due to real estate constraints, or that are negotiating a new lease at a new 100% affordable housing development. So more specifically, to define what we mean by organizations that are at risk of displacement, they have a lease that is expiring in 18 months. They have a month-to-month lease. They may have a lack of site control, or they may be facing other conditions that are putting them at risk. In terms of barriers to growth, to demonstrate this, organizations must submit a narrative that describes what their need for more programming space in their application, as well as a description of how having more space would impact their programming and the communities that they serve. Next slide, please. And so here I'll share a little bit about the services that are provided through the technical assistance side of the program. We have a fantastic team of consultants that work really closely with organizations to support them. And so they meet with them and offer financial and space planning. They also support with identifying and evaluating potential sites for their projects. They also support with developing construction budgets as well as timelines. I'll note here that we have templates of some of these items that you could use on our website as well for free, as our team supports you. Our team of consultants can also support you with the analyzing of potential funding sources. They can also give you referrals to architects, engineers, contractors, attorneys, or any other folks that can support your project. And so applications for the technical assistance program are accepted on a rolling basis and are declined or approved within 45 days. So they're not tied to the application deadline for the lease stabilization and acquisition programs. I see questions coming in. I will make sure to answer them once I'm done with them after I go through the next two slides. I'll also add here that we encourage organizations to schedule a free 45-minute rapid response consult inquiry call with one of our consultants before you submit your application for technical assistance. The call is really just a space for you to share your concerns and for our consultants to provide you with strategic thought partnership, their expertise, and connect you with resources that can help you with your projects. Next slide, please. And so really quickly, a recap of the application timeline. The application opened on December 1st of last year. We held an informational webinar on December 15th, and a recording of that is available on the website. Now we are in the second webinar. Thank you for joining us. I will make sure to get the slides to you so you can access them as well. The application deadline, as I mentioned, is Friday, January 28th at 12 p.m. And again, the application portal closes at that time. So I encourage you to submit your application earlier so that we can support you with any questions or technical issues that might come up along the way. Consultation calls are required for folks that are applying to acquisition grants only. So those are taking place between January 14th and Friday, January 21st. And the last day to schedule that call is today. So please be sure to use the link that we shared in the chat, or that you will get. I'm happy to send it over as well. Grants will be announced the week of March 21st of 2022. And the disbursement deadline is Tuesday, February 28th of 2023. Next slide. And so here you'll see, once you receive this deck, you'll have access to the links to all the program materials. And so that includes the website for the whole program. We also have a frequently asked questions page where we post and frequently update with the questions that we receive. So you'll see some of the questions that come through this conversation posted there as well if they're not there already. You can also see here that we have links to both programs guidelines as well as the application portal. There's also a link to the checklist of required information, and for the acquisition grants, the link to schedule your consultation call. Lastly, there's the technical assistance side where you also have the links to the application, as well as the link to the to schedule a mini consultation call with our team. Next slide. And that is the end of that. I do want to make sure that we get to the questions. Thank you all for submitting them in the chat. Let's see, I'm going to scroll up really quickly. Let me start with the Q&A. Oh, there are no in the Q&A. So let's see. We'll start with Kathy's question. Can you talk a little bit about the rent per square feet, per square footage, and if you need to demonstrate what that means that new lease is higher? So in the application portal, you'll be able to enter information about your previous lease as well as your current lease. So we'll have that way to compare the two and know what the difference is in the amount. And as I mentioned earlier, the program supports organizations with rent stipends for the difference between the two costs of their previous lease and their current lease. I will also read your situation. It says, we are currently in our new home and paying less rent because we made the move before the grant became available, but we are struggling to meet our existing expenses. Because our contracts did not change. Is this considered rent negotiation? I'll just note here that to piggyback off of the previous question, you would not be eligible for a rent stipend, but you can be eligible for lease negotiation if you're able to explain that within your application and what happened and what the process was. And obviously if it falls within the eligibility period. Let's see. I am scrolling. I see one more question from Gabriel. If we are experiencing a barrier to growth and have identified a space, do we need to submit a double-signed LOI to be eligible, or is a set address enough? So the LOI or the fully executed lease is required. So the address would not satisfy that requirement. And yes, it would need to be signed by both you, the organization, and your landlord. And obviously, that would also need to fall within the look back period, which is October 1st of 2020. I see another question from Kathy. We are similar to RAMS in providing mental health therapy to kids in San Francisco, and they're struggling to try to serve so many kids. I noticed that you replied to RAMS. Could you offer particular support to us, Oaks Children's Center? And thanks. I wrote this note only to host. We can definitely support you. If you would like to chat more about your specific case, I do encourage you to email us at grantmaking@communityvisionca.org. We're happy to schedule a call with you to discuss your specific situation and go through the options that you may have.
And Camila, I just wanted to jump in just to add a little more context and information to the rent stipend, which can sometimes be a little bit of a confusing calculation. So the rent stipend is available for up to 6 months for organizations that are facing higher per square foot rent. And it's really meant to support organizations that have to go out on the rental market or face higher costs and have been paying a lower amount of rent, and now all of a sudden are faced with this, massively increased rent. So if you're signing a new lease, or if you have a lease that's been executed between October 1st of 2020 and the application deadline, and you're eligible to apply, then you would be eligible for the rent stipend if you have the same amount of square feet or greater, and the cost per square foot has gone up. If you downsize, you could still be eligible as long as the cost per square foot has still gone up. So hopefully that clarifies things. And I'm looking at a few more questions here. Let's see. Okay, Kathy, I see your question. Kathy, feel free to reach out to us if you want to talk about your rent details offline. We're happy to walk through those calculations or answer any other questions you have. Krista, I see you have a question too. Please describe you want more clarity on the question here. Please describe the governance structure that will be used to operate the space. So that would be, if you're co-locating with another organization, we want to know, who is going to be doing what within the space. Is one person going to be, responsible for delivering services, and another one's responsible for like administrative duties? If there are financial obligations, is one organization responsible versus another? If you're a single organization in the space and you're not co-locating, then you could just say that, or this question may not apply to you. Krista, please reach back out. Hannah, hello. I see your question. You are in the same space with a 3-year lease, but struggling with rent due to COVID. Would we still be eligible? So you would need to have a lease that's renewed or signed between the look back period and the application deadline. So it has to be executed between October 1st of 2020 and January 28th of 2022. If your lease was executed before October 1st of 2020, then you wouldn't be eligible in this funding cycle. Hopefully that helps, but if not, please feel free to reach back out to clarify. And Krista, I did just double check the application, and the question you're asking about only shows up if you select yes to the co-location question. So it's a conditional question. If you select no to co-location project, you will not be asked to answer that question. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Anita. Thank you, Gabriel, Kathy, Jonathan, Hannah, Krista, everyone for coming tonight. Please reach out to us if you have other questions and help spread the word.
Thanks so much, everybody. Just to let you know that we're going to have all of the links and resources that we talked about available when we email you the presentation. It will have clickable links on it, and also we'll email you the recording. And the recording is going to be up on the website soon. And feel free to view the previous recording. Some people may have asked questions that you might also have. So I will go ahead and sign us off. Thanks so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your night.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.